wonderful to have you here. So glad you guys came. This is the first annual Roots Conference. So that makes, I realize that makes you guys charter members of the Roots Conference. So feel yourself blessed and honored in that way. Today we have a wonderful guest with us, Dr. Herrmann, and I've been pleased to hear such wonderful things about his work at the seminary, and wanted to introduce him to you. Dr. Herrmann is the Associate Professor of Historical Theology and the Chairman of the Department of Historical Theology, the Director of Theological Resources and Special Projects, and the Director of the Center for Reformation Research at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. And we're pleased to have you here, Dr. Herrmann, and I'll hand it over to you. So, thank you. Let's give Dr. Herrmann a hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Sort of? Kind of? I'm loud, so. Is it on? Testing. 1, 2. I have delicate ears, so it doesn't want to work for me. All right. Good. Hopefully this won't be distracting. Thank you for inviting me to this. This is your inaugural conference. It just so happens your inaugural conference is on the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, at least the year it's coming up here. We're in October. Most people don't care about that and don't think about it, but historians are popular this year, so we're just milking it for all that it's worth. Maybe some of you saw today the PBS. Any of you see the PBS show on Luther that was on? Martin Luther Changed the World? You know what? This isn't going well. Thank you. This is what PhDs are for. All right, sorry about that. I think my ears are... Anyway, so that was one project I was involved in. A lot of us were glad to see that go on to PBS. October 2017, Luther's getting some attention. It'll probably be in Time magazine, and so he'll have 15 minutes of fame again. But for Lutherans, we're particularly excited. The Catholics not so much, but they're commemorating, not celebrating. Perhaps I can get a handheld, that'll probably be better. Is there a handheld that...
I'm looking for one. Is Alex?
Alex had one, so I was wondering, is that it there?
Test
1, 2.
Yeah, let's see that. I can get a little better. Yeah, that's just, I don't want that to happen anymore. So what I thought I would do, just turn it down a little bit, and I'll run it this way. What I thought I would do is tonight give an overview of the context of the Reformation, the world of Martin Luther, the world of the 15th and 16th century that set the stage for it, because it's a very different world than ours. And then tomorrow, if I don't blow out your eardrums tonight, but tomorrow if you come back, we'll look more closely at Luther's particular reform efforts. We only have about 45 minutes tonight, or 15 after whatever happened here. Hopefully if there's some time, we'll have some questions. We can engage a little bit that way. Tomorrow we have a little bit more time, and I'll be happy to entertain questions along the way. So I'll try to pause at a couple of points to give you an opportunity to comment. So, Luther, of course, 500 years. This is a long time ago. I was talking to my neighbor, and we were at a council meeting for the county, and we were sitting down in chairs, and he says, what do you do? I said, well, I teach church history, especially the Reformation. You know, this year's, I've traveled a lot because it's the 500th anniversary. He said, oh, has it been 500 years already? As if it just ran by, right? But it is actually it's quite a long time ago. I mean, when I think of a long time ago, I think of black and white photos. How are we to understand a man like Luther who lived so long ago? And just we who send 6,000 tweets every second, who search more than 40,000 Google queries every second, and every second we send more than 2 million emails. When Luther traveled to Rome, it took him over a month. The furthest place that I traveled this year for Luther conferences was Brazil, which is 5 times longer than Luther's trip, and I made it in just over 14 hours. But of course, technology and the difference between our world and his world is just the tip of the iceberg. The world of Luther was vastly different than ours in social makeup, in its political landscape, its intellectual climate. And the religious world was likewise distant. Its thought and its theology based on assumptions about God, grace and merit, communion and community that seems very strange to us today. So, I'm just going to highlight a couple of those aspects of Luther's world that jump out at us as different, but also very important for understanding why the Reformation happened in the way that it did. So the first one, Luther's world was a world full of a world, not a word, a world full of devils. In that regard, the people of Luther's world were very similar to the people that lived even 1,000 years before him. Their view of the world was a view in which spiritual beings filled the air. There's a book on a biography on St. Augustine, who lived in the 4th and 5th centuries, by Peter Brown, and he wrote of the people of Augustine's day, it would be very much applicable to Luther's day as well, that they felt that the physical world was as full of malevolent demons as intensely as we feel the presence of myriads of dangerous bacteria. In such a context, Christian sacraments and relics could be treated as much as a vaccine for physical protection as it was nourishment for one's spiritual life. It was a world where old pagan views persisted in popular piety alongside genuinely Christian practices. The cycles and rhythms of the seasons, the weather, remained a deeply ingrained structure of life that harkened back to the pre-Christian migrations, and it was a world of magic and superstition, one that could hijack the holiest of Christian words, hoc est corpus meum, which is the Latin for "this is my body," and transform them into hocus pocus, into incantations and hexes. And we see a lot of the early medieval practices of the sacraments were efforts to try to prevent people from doing magic. They made sure that they would receive the host in their mouth. They couldn't receive it in their hand because they wanted to make sure that they didn't take it home with them and do spells, or put it bury it in the ground to make sure the crops would grow. So there was a poignant sense that the people in the Middle Ages were just scraping by on their Christian worldview. One of the studies Jean Develue studied on Catholic Reformation in France, and he said that, quote, "the intellectual and psychological climate of the people was characterized by a profound unfamiliarity with the basics of Christianity, and by a persistent pagan mentality with the occasional vestiges of pre-Christian ceremonials. Even the relatively orthodox Christian and priest might delve into alchemy, or dabbled with astrology well into the 17th century. A very famous book by Keith Thomas. He did a study on popular religion in England called Religion and the Decline of Magic. And he studies all the way into the 17th century and sees how this persists all the way through the Reformation period. The medieval church certainly went through great lengths to suppress many of the abuses. Though sometimes it seemed better and more pastoral to just simply adapt pre-Christian ceremonies into Christian rites and practices. You see this with things like already in the early church, taking the pagan celebration of the god of the sun, who was born on December 25th, and then bringing the birth of the SON on December 25th. And there was all sorts of efforts to take pagan practices and layer over Christian ones on top of it, baptize them, if you will. The effort of Christianization was a long journey, so long that at times segments of the church could forget where they were actually going. Rather than curb superstition and idolatry, the church seemed to tolerate it, and in some cases actually perpetuate it. At least that was the growing feeling in the cities, where the peasant was increasingly replaced by the literate and educated people. In the urban context especially, there were calls for reform, and they were more frequent. Reform of churchly abuses and reform of Christian piety. And here's several scholars have tried to understand the Reformation in this context and labeled this process called re-Christianization. Christianization is the effort of the church to take all those German barbarian immigrants coming in from the East and make them Christian. And this happens after the fall of Rome, well into 1000 AD. But there's a sense in which it wasn't fully realized. And so 14th, 15th, 16th century can be understood as a re-Christianization process, an effort in which priests and then eventually reformers are all trying to make people more Christian. And this means that the Protestants and the Catholics are all engaged in the same work. It's just that the Protestants denounce, they go a little bit further. They see a lot of the things that the Catholics have been doing to actually make matters worse. They saw traditional religion of pilgrimages and relics and private masses and venerations to saints to be part of the problem, to be part of superstition that had invaded into the church. They saw much of late medieval church sanctioned ceremonies and devotional practices as an extension of idolatry and would often call it such. So think about Luther's remarks, for instance, in 1522, when he says, and he says this sarcastically, which is why we like to read Luther, because he has a lot of sarcasm, but what would happen if Christians would consider it necessary to receive the Lord's Supper in true repentance, he asks. And he says, heavens, if this idea were really put across, people took the sacrament seriously and truly were repentant, it would mean that where thousands came to the sacrament, now scarcely hundreds would come. And so we would see at last become again a group of real Christians, whereas at present we are almost completely pagan and only Christian in name. And Luther's expression there about most of us being pagan rather than Christian is not just a one-off. He says this repeatedly. He says a Christian is a rare bird, which is strange because everyone he knows was baptized the day after they were born. He doesn't know any real pagans. He doesn't know any atheists. He may have met a Jewish person. But by and large, everyone around him is, quote, officially part of the church. And yet there's this sense in which, for reformers as well as others, true Christians aren't very present. Likewise, it's not without significance that Luther's reform of the very center of Christian practice, the sacraments, was definitively launched in a treatise called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And that title implies that the Roman papacy had become pagan and had become a ruler and a tyrant and had imprisoned the church. So he just extended this language of languishing paganism, and said that this is something that actually continues to be our problem in the church. The reasons why reformers considered such practices as sub-Christian and idolatrous can differ. So Luther had one set of reasons, Zwingli had another, Calvin had some others. But most commonly it's due to a rekindled reading and priority given to the scriptures and the fathers of early Christianity that revealed that there was this big discontinuity between what Christians believed and practiced early on and what the Christians had started doing in the late Middle Ages. And what was once in the early biblical Christianity was trying to be reinstated. Now, responsible for this was Renaissance humanism, but also some observant monasticism, and we'll talk about some of that a little bit later. I like this idea that reformers and the late medieval church were all trying to make people more Christian. It explains a lot of things going on, especially in Luther's thought. It doesn't excuse some of the things that Luther says, but at least explains somewhat why he acted with impatience and ultimately vitriol against the Jews. And I don't know if you know this, he said horrible things about the Jews at the end of his life. Just Google it. Someone's raving about it. But in an effort, the reason why he did is this idea of Christianization. He just assumed that once the gospel was clarified, that the Jews would convert to Christianity in droves. I mean, he said, he didn't blame Jews for not converting to Roman papacy. He says, who would want to convert to that? But once the gospel was perfectly clear, he just figured everybody would come over. And when they didn't, and actually, in a sense, asked him to stop trying to convert them, Luther grew disappointed and frustrated, and eventually all of that frustration is well documented at the end of his life. Let me pause there. But the one thing I would add to this, and I'm going to bring it up tomorrow, is another way to talk about what Luther is doing and what a lot of these guys are doing in the 15th and 16th century is not just re-Christianization, but re-religionization, which is a fun, made-up word. But it has to do with the fact that being religious is understood very differently than the way we understand it today. Being religious is a very technical term. It has to do with being, if you're religious, you've taken monastic vows. That's the definition. You have taken the vow of celibacy, of obedience, and poverty, and you live in a monastic community or in a mendicant community. But that's what it means to be religious. And in some sense, the Reformation can be understood as a redefinition of what it meant to be religious, but it can also be seen as kind of a radical extension of making everyone religious, and I'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. But let me pause. Any questions or comments on what I've said so far, just on this idea of re-Christianization and kind of the magical pagan context of the Reformation? Yeah?
Can you say a little bit of, you mentioned where the focus actually came from? You put it up there, but...
so it's generally understood that hocus pocus is a popular aberration of the words of institution. So the laity, of course, knew something really important was happening when the priest said some words over some bread and some wine, and then magically they were transformed into the body and blood of Christ. They weren't exactly sure. But so there's that. And there's also the fact that the words of institution weren't something that was proclaimed, certainly not in their own language, and not even in Latin. They tended to be whispered. So if you could get close enough to hear the priest do his thing up there, you could hear something like hocus corpus meum, hocus pocus, and eventually you thought, well, if it worked to make that, maybe I can go home and have my goose lay golden eggs or something. So that's where it came from. It came from an attempt to take a Christian practice and do magic. Other questions about just the Middle Ages? Yes?
The Dark Ages were right before this,
Well, so the question is, am I talking about the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, or how that's... They're kind of synonyms. Well, first of all, anyone that lived during this time didn't know they were living in the Dark Ages. And they didn't have a t-shirt saying, I'm in the Middle Ages. The phrase is pejorative, right? I mean, Dark Ages, nobody wants to live in the Dark Ages. Who wants to live in the Middle Ages? It's between two things, right? And basically, the people who came up with that label of medieval or middle or Dark Ages were the Renaissance humanists, the Renaissance, which we'll be talking about shortly. So the Renaissance grows into the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, comes to a high point at the time of the Reformation. And the point of the Renaissance humanists is that they look back before the fall of Rome to that classical period in which people were very well educated, and it was kind of the high point of civilization. And now they saw themselves, one of them said, I feel like I'm in a shadow land, and I'm living in an age of darkness, which is just about to dawn and have a rebirth of that period of time. So it's between classical antiquity and the Renaissance, which is this rebirth of classical antiquity, and it's in the middle. It's not quite fair to say that everybody between the fall of Rome and the 15th century were a bunch of adults living in the Dark Ages. That's always what the people who want to argue that they're living in a new age and degrade that period before them would say. I mean, education was gradually growing from the 9th century on, so that we can see actually a lot of advancements in the Middle Ages before the Reformation. It's like being postmodern. Right? I mean, it's just arrogant. I'm all over. I'm done with modern. I'm post. Any other questions or comments just on this period that I'm referring to? All right, well, we'll move on a little bit. Another thing about Luther's world, Luther's world was the end of the world. At least that's how it seemed for people. There was Islam, which was making an enormous reach toward engulfing Europe into the Ottoman Caliphate. In Luther's lifetime, they reached all the way up to Vienna. The plague appeared again and again throughout Europe. Every year, somewhere, the plague rose up its head. It was unpredictable, but deadly. It did come through Saxony, a couple of different points in Luther's life. And the church also had experienced a significant schism within its recent past, a papal schism, where we had two popes at one time. And so they called a council and they deposed both of those popes and elected a third one, and no one abdicated. So we had three popes. This causes a great point of crisis and conscience for the church. And then also, this Pope versus Emperor became significant, so that there was quite a bit of fragmentation in the church and the empire, and it had not yet healed by the time Luther was on the scene. Church and empire were dangerously close to dissolution. Now, much has been written on what's called apocalypticism. So apocalypse just means revealing what was hidden. But apocalyptic usually has to do with end of the world kind of stuff. Apocalypticism of this age was especially exhibited in the more radical element of the Reformation. Perhaps the most famous example was the Anabaptist takeover of the city of Münster, which is in northwest Germany. I don't want to get lost in too much of the details of this, but there was expectations of an imminent second coming of Christ, which were high among many of the Anabaptist groups in the lowlands. And with the ground in Münster prepared by a certain Lutheran pastor who was a bit radical, the Anabaptists won over the city in 1534, and they proclaimed Münster as the New Jerusalem. And all property distinctions were abolished, and it was all held in common, Rebaptism for adults was mandatory, and then preparations were made for the return of Christ and the start of his millennial kingdom, evidently in Münster. One of the guys declared himself King David and reinstituted polygamy. It sounds a lot like Waco, Texas. But anyway, it kind of ended that way too. They expelled the bishop from the city, and then he came back and laid siege to the city with the princes. And in the end, the leaders were tortured and executed and hung in baskets from the church tower of St. Lambert's. And you can see them right there, those baskets. Incidentally, the baskets are actually still hanging from the church tower at St. Lambert's in Münster. There's a photograph of modern day. Münster is a very nice city. There's not very much crime there anymore. Might have something to do with the visuals. The most important example, though, of apocalypticism in the 16th century and why there was this angst over the last days would be in the Peasants' War, 1524 and 1525. It began in 1524 when the peasants of Stühlingen revolted, and it's not exactly clear what the catalyst was. The peasants actually were doing pretty well in Germany. They weren't in serfdom like in early medieval feudalism. They actually had advanced some rights. But it would seem that this one event where the Countess of Stühlingen ordered the peasants to gather snail shells so that she could wind her yarn around the snail shells. So they had to gather snails from underneath the strawberries so she could just make little spools. That she was treating them like serfs. And this had finally kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And it started a rebellion, and a lot of disgruntled peasants, for other reasons besides snail shells, joined this movement. And the rebellion spread from southwest toward the north and east until a third of Germany was in uproar. If you can imagine, it's the whole social order is being turned upside down. The peasants are throwing out dukes and princes out of their castles. They're taking over churches. They're burning churches to the ground, executing priests. And so this was quite frightening. Luther's evangelical reforms were grabbed hold of and argued for as a catalyst. It wasn't really the cause of the Peasants' War. And there were some who capitalized on the religious tones of the rebellion, especially Luther's former student, Thomas Münzer. He was first an eager adherent to Luther's cause. Münzer increasingly became filled with the zeal of the Old Testament prophet. His theology was animated by the notion that the world was about to end. And here's a quote. "Oh, how ripe the rotten apples are," he wrote. "Oh, how rotten the elect have become. The time of harvest has come. That is why God himself has hired me for his harvest." It didn't go well for Münzer or the Peasants' Revolt. Eventually, the princes put it to an end and killed thousands and thousands in absolute slaughter. When Thomas Münzer led his group against the princes, he shouted that, "Do not fear, God will protect us, and I will catch their cannonballs in my sleeves," he said. And then he saw a rainbow, and he said, "Look, see, there's a promise of the rainbow." Of course, the princes saw the rainbow too, and thought it was for them. And by the end, all of them were dead. They found Münzer under a bed, hiding, and then they had him tortured and executed. Now, when Luther was terrified of the Peasants' Revolt as well. In fact, more than once he thought the world was coming to an end. Now, he did something quite, I don't know, have you ever heard the phrase that Luther didn't say, but it's often attributed to him, that if the world were going to end tomorrow, I would plant an apple tree today. Just cool and weird. He didn't say it, but it sounds like something he should say. Actually, he did something even weirder. When the peasants was coming in to Saxony in 1525, he decided this was the perfect time to get married. And he wrote to his friends, he says, "The peasants may come and I may die, but before I die, I will marry my Katie to spite the devil." So Luther thought he was at the end of perhaps the end of his life, at the end of the world, but he had an interesting way of handling it. He always saw more than just emperors or princes, peasants and popes. He saw their actions against the background of salvation history, which St. Paul, of course, says is not a striving against flesh and blood, but powers and principalities in the present darkness. But for Luther, the most significant aspect of this period of time that set forth before him the idea that we were at the end of the world was the notion that the Pope was the Antichrist. And again, we're sort of not accustomed, poor old Pope Francis, what a nice guy. So we tend not to kind of walk around talking about the Pope being the Antichrist. And that's fine, I'm not arguing that one should, but you have to understand in Luther's day how this sort of played out for him and what it meant for him. Throughout the Middle Ages, actually, people called the Pope Antichrist. This isn't new. Here we have medieval paintings before Luther, pictures of the Pope with the devil whispering in his ear, etc. It was a rhetorical slur, and it could be a statement of true conviction. But Luther's view was a bit different. Already in 1518, when he met with the papal legate, Cardinal Cajetan. So the papal legate is the representative or the ambassador of the Pope, so he is the Pope for Luther. So 1518, this is 1 year after he nailed the 95 Theses. He's in big trouble after this. And so they send this cardinal to deal with Luther. His job is to get him to recant. The meeting didn't go well. The Cajetan wouldn't debate Luther, he just demanded that he would recant. And Luther says, "I can't recant or renounce the thing that made me a Christian." He said, "I would be the most accommodating and beloved person if I were to say the simple word revoco, Latin for I recant. But I will not become a heretic by denying the understanding through which I've been made a Christian." After this meeting with Cajetan, Luther suggested privately in letters and with trepidation the possibility that the Pope might be the real Antichrist. And he wrote this to a letter to his friend Wenceslaus Link. In public, he didn't. He still recognized the possibility of the papacy and its authority in the church. In fact, in 1519, he wrote a letter to the Pope. It starts this way. "Most Blessed Father, I did not, nor do I want today in any way to assault or pull down with any type of deceit the sovereignty of the Roman Church or that of your holiness. Nothing whatsoever in heaven and on earth is to be placed before it aside from Jesus Christ, the one Lord of all. For there is one thing alone that I seek, that our mother, the Roman Church, might not be polluted with the filth of a foreign avarice, and that the people might not be seduced into error, and learn to set indulgences before love. About everything else I could not care less. If there is even more that I can do or learn, I am no doubt prepared to do so." So in 1519, Luther is ready to submit to the Pope, or ready to recognize his authority as long as certain things are allowed to stay in his teaching. But he's very reverent at this point. But privately, he's starting to wonder. And the turning point comes in 1520 when the Pope excommunicates him. And he starts thinking about, it becomes obvious to him that in 1519 he has this debate with Johannes Eck. And he says, the Pope is the Pope by human authority, not by divine authority. And Eck says, no, he's by divine authority. They go, nuh-uh, 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 nuh-uh. They go back and forth on this. And eventually Luther says, actually, the councils also have made mistakes. And Eck says, you sound just like this guy, Jan Hus. And And Luther says, I know it's not like John Hus. John Hus is a heretic. He was burned at the stake 100 years ago. And so then he goes back and he starts reading John Hus's writings. And he says, oh my gosh, I'm a Hussite. That sunk in. He realized that a church council, had burned someone who he believed taught the gospel. And burned someone because he taught the gospel. And at that point, Luther wrote to his friend Spalatin, and he says, I am dumbfounded. I don't even know what to think, seeing such a terrifying judgment of God among men, that the true gospel is considered worthy of being damned, having been torched so blatantly in public for over 100 years that no one can admit it. It is the woe of the world. And then 4 days later, he wrote another letter to the same guy and said, good God, I am so overwhelmingly horrified in the very depths of my being that I can scarcely doubt that the Pope is the very Antichrist which, as commonly known, the world has expected, since it all fits, how he lives, what he does, what he says, and what he proclaims. And so then, in 1521, he's excommunicated. The papal bull comes in 1520, and beginning of 1521. And everyone comes to Luther's defense, including people who would eventually be his enemies, Erasmus and others. They're all kind of waiting to see what Luther would say. And they're all saying things like, this isn't fair, you haven't given Luther a hearing, you've excommunicated, you're just strong-arming him. And then Luther writes, and he says, this is my summary. If you want to be a Christian, you have to reject the Pope as the Antichrist. Whoa, that escalated quickly. And suddenly you realize you couldn't follow Luther and be excited about him and stay at the church. And people split at that moment. And so this was a decisive moment for Luther. It's not one that we sort of have in the front of our head the way we think about the Roman papacy in the same way he did. But at the end of his life, he recognized that this was the turning point for him. This was when he realized that he was living at the end of the world. And that explains a lot of the things he wrote and said. And if you're not living at the end of the world, you might approach things a little differently. Questions or comments on Luther and apocalypticism, things I highlighted. All right. Teacher waits until you feel comfortable. All right. The last thing we'll talk about tonight, we have about 10 to 15 minutes. Luther's world was the world of Renaissance humanism, which I know sounds dramatic, not really, but it was. It's a very important context. And I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the Middle Ages. Life in the city was qualitatively different than rural and agrarian life. And this is important to realize that leading up to the 16th century, we were seeing more and more people moving into the city. There was a phrase, what was it? Stadtluft macht man frei. City life makes one free. You were free to do a lot more things than when you were just trying to gather snail shells or dig up turnips. But it also was complicated. Life in the field of the countryside was shaped just by the weather and the cycles of the seasons, and it was tended to be stratified and quite stable. But in the city, life was in greater flux, and wit, ingenuity, and creativity was needed. And Renaissance humanism was a fitting approach, especially to life in the cities and to a more educated, common people that were more educated. So what is Renaissance humanism? Well, it's an educational movement, really, Sometimes we use the word humanism today to talk about atheists or people who care more about humans than God. That doesn't apply to the humanists in the 15th and 16th century. They're all very religious, and especially in the North, they're very religious. Essentially, they stress moral philosophy as a point of virtue and wisdom. History was important, political theory as a reflection of reality, poetry was important as an expression of feeling, and above all, rhetoric. We use the word rhetoric usually negatively, as empty rhetoric. Rhetoric, of course, is one of the classical three of the trivium, and rhetoric is a discipline. It's the culmination of what the trivium is supposed to be about, which is to be winsome, make articulation of one's thought that moves people into action. The stamped character of Northern humanism is particularly important. So you have humanism in Italy, people like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, which is largely an artistic movement. But in the North, it's really also very much a religious movement. It's really a religious reform movement in and of itself. They have this desire to return to the early fathers, to return back to the scriptures, and especially the scriptures in their original language, in Greek and Hebrew. And they were also hostile, or at least less excited about the kind of theology that was taught in the universities, scholastic theology. And so they thought with a rebirth of classical studies, they could bring about a renewal of Christian faith and piety. This movement is often called biblical humanism, and it was especially prevalent north of the Alps. The phrase that was commonly referred to was ad fontes, back to the well springs, back to the sources, back to the beginning of things. And that usually meant going back to the early texts, whether it was Cicero for classical antiquity or back to the early texts of Christianity, the Bible, the early fathers. There was a sense among these humanists that the ancient sources of Christianity, along with other classical works, could serve both spiritual and educational goals. So you see this with, especially this Erasmus fellow here. There he is, yeah, Erasmus. He replaced the convoluted Aristotelian philosophy that was prevalent in the medieval schools with a simple piety, which he called the Philosophia Christi, the philosophy of Christ, which just was about a renewed reading of the New Testament. He published the first Greek New Testament in 1516, which Luther used. And this was intended to help reform the church. He helped publish collected works of the early church fathers, like Jerome, Augustine, again, with the purpose of reforming the church. Luther encountered various forms of humanism in his early education, and he used it. He learned Hebrew and he learned Greek. But there was also a sense among the adherents of the new learning that Luther's reform agenda was the same as their own. In other words, Luther may not have been a humanist, but the humanists thought he was one of theirs. And that was really important for the spread of the Reformation early on. After all, he was arguing for a return to the scriptures. He was arguing for a return to certain church fathers like Augustine. At one of the disputations, the Heidelberg disputation in 1518 that he held. In 1518, of course, 1 year after the 95 Theses, and the Augustinian monks would have a conference like you guys are having. And every year they would invite someone to be the main speaker. I guess like me. They thought, let's ask Luther, because he's in so much trouble. And so Luther gave this disputation in Heidelberg, and when he was done, people just, their mouths fell open, and one of the guys who was a humanist, Martin Butzer, attended, and he said that Luther is saying explicitly and out loud what Erasmus only says behind closed doors. In other words, Luther is carrying out publicly the reform program of the humanists. Why is that important? Because it's the humanists that read Luther. It's the humanists that tend to own all the printing presses. It's the humanists who keep printing Luther. The printing press was an indispensable part of the reception of Luther's writings, his ideas, and the Reformation. The 15th century, of course, was the beginning of the printing press with movable type by Johannes Gutenberg, who was a goldsmith, and he introduced this mechanical movable type into the technology of bookmaking in Mainz. But it was a technology that was waiting for a blockbuster writer. There was lots of things that they were trying to print, but it was looking for a message to really take off. Luther's ideas, his brilliant style, and ability to communicate to such a wide range and such power and emotion was the printer's dream come true. And so between 1517 and 1520, Luther's publications sold well over 300,000 copies. Again, the majority of people can't read. So this is an enormous, he is the first bestseller. In 1519, the humanist printer in Basel said one of his treatises, the address to the German nobility, he says, "We've never seen such sales as with this book." And in 1521, his opponents would say, no printers will not sell anything but Luther's books. And it's terrible for those printers that were in Catholic territories where they were prohibited from printing Luther's writings because they were losing out on all the money. And so Luther was extremely popular. When he wrote his German New Testament in 1522, and you remember, his German New Testament was written, he translated it from Greek into German while he was in the castle in the Wartburg. He did it in 11 weeks. And he sent it off in 1522. And it sold 5,000 copies in 2 months, 50 printings in 4 years, and each printing is about 1,000 copies. And over 200,000 printings over the course of the next 12 years. And it was the humanists who were excited about Luther, would read Luther, would drag his name into town councils, and he basically made him famous. By the time Luther went to the Diet of Worms, by the time he was excommunicated, Luther was easily the most read and the most famous person in Europe. Luther went viral, if you will. And that had never happened before. And Luther was heavily engaged in the process. He helped create, and you can see this print face here with this lovely border around. He and his friend Lucas Cranach, who was the artist who painted all the paintings of Luther, helped develop the idea of having a title page that stood out. People hadn't done that before. Eventually he started using Luther's seal and putting his name very large. So you could walk by at a bookstore and you could see immediately, oh, that's a Luther thing, because it looked different. In short order, those are sort of the three big things I wanted to highlight this evening. Was the kind of the medieval context of superstition, the notion of the end of the world coming on, and then of course the intellectual context of humanism and the printing press. All of those things were incredibly important to understand why Luther took off in the way that he did. Any final comments or questions before we end tonight? Yes?
Was Luther intentionally media savvy, or was he as surprised as anybody else in what was required?
Originally surprised, but then incredibly intentional later. So originally the 95 Theses, he didn't have them printed and distributed, and so he was surprised how quick those things moved. But that he learned something quickly from that. And you can read in his writings how he gets in, like in letters, he gets annoyed with the printer at Wittenberg because he doesn't like the way he does fonts. So they get a new one in, and he's very particular about the way that his pamphlets look, because he knows if they look sloppy, they indicate, you guys all heard this from your teachers, you turn and say, you don't take pride in your work. The ideas that are important should look like there's some gravitas to it. And so he became extremely savvy. There's a book that was written a couple of years ago called Brand Luther by Andrew Pettigrew. And it's just about this. It's about Luther's media savvy and the fact that he actually created a brand for himself for the sake of perpetuating these ideas. Do you want to follow up or add another question?
A different thing. Would you just
the other humans that you had up there with?
Well, that was Philip Melanchthon. So I put up two of the most famous and important humanists in the 16th century. Erasmus is a bit older, was well known, but when Luther started reforms at the university, he wanted to get a Greek teacher, and they brought in Philip Melanchthon, who was only 21 at the time, and became Luther's colleague all the way through his life. But he was a rising star of humanism.
And the author of the Augsburg Confession.
And the author of the Augsburg, well, one of the authors of the Augsburg Confession, and the author of the Apology. Other questions? Yeah?
The humanists equate going back to the classical.
Yeah.
So is that good or bad? They're equating scripture to like Aristotle.
I think it's hope you all heard the question. They're not equating that Aristotle has the same authority for church life as Scripture does. I think it's the idea that the basic principle is if you want to excel at something and learn more deeply about a subject matter, you should go back to the original sources that deal with that subject matter rather than later commentaries. And one of their criticisms of how things were done in the university is people would just kind of quote each other and never really go back to those original sources. So it's the same expression of, Scripture is the font of theology. Cicero is the font of, political stoicism or something like that, or Aristotle of a certain kind of logic and philosophy. So go back to those sources for those different areas, but they didn't necessarily equate the two. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the one of this thing had this became more like
So that kind of humanism has no genetic connection to these. It's post-enlightenment. So you're really looking at the intellectual enlightenment and eventually kind of the 19th century in particular, is what you can call humanists. But they really don't have much in common with these folks. I mean, the word is, they were people who were engaged in the studia humanitatis. That's where they got their names, which is the humane study, the humanities. And so it was the kinds of things that helped human beings flourish. That was their interest. That's where they got the name from. Anything else? Good, no one fell asleep. A couple people checked their watch, but nobody was shaking. It just was broken, so I feel pretty good about that. So tomorrow, I guess, we're going to meet at 10:30. Is that right?
Yep, we'll be on.
I'm going to be back in St. Charles at 10:30. Maybe it'll be Zoom. And we'll continue this and talk a little bit more in depth about the Reformation. And hopefully, a little bit more Q&A. One more time for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Herrmann. That was extremely informative and delightful to learn about where we've come from and where we're headed. Appreciate that. So at this point, at 9 o'clock, we're going to have Compline, which is going to be over at the sanctuary where we came from, right next to that atrium area. And I have been asked to ask you if we can all sit in the front and behind the pulpit. So, unleash their anger. So we will conclude that around 9:30. And in the morning, where breakfast begins at 8:30 until 9:15 here. Actually, it'll be back behind the wall area there, but in this building, basically, tomorrow at 8:30. So with that, God bless your evening, and we'll see you next door in about 5 minutes.
And if you want a hoodie, like a Roots 2017 hoodie, they're just $30 cheap. See me, sign up, and your order, we'll send it to you. There it is.
They're quality too.